Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this fourth edition of our webinar series on the Indian foreign policy, people, power, and perspectives. I'm Shalini Yog, Deputy Director at the Heinrich Boll Foundation's New Delhi office, and I'm delighted to welcome you. For those unfamiliar, we are a political foundation affiliated with the Green Party in Germany. The webinar series is being co-hosted together with Council on Strategic and Defense Research in Delhi, with the aim to analyze the intricacies of India's foreign policy as it positions itself as a global power. In this session, we will focus on the foreign policy implications of Trump's victory at 2024 US presidential election from an Indian perspective, but also including of what this means for Europe and the Indo-European relationship. President Trump's picks for key positions in his second administration quite underline the extent to which US politics and its international relations are about to be reshaped. This applies as much to security policy as it does to trade relations or climate diplomacy. Compared to Germany and Europe at large, reactions in India to Trump 2.0 have been decidedly less nervous. The good relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Narendra Modi is certainly a factor here, and so is the fact that the US continues to view India as a key ally in the Indo-Pacific. At the same time, India's treasured strategic autonomy could be pressured by Trump's loyalty demands in instances where geopolitical interests and approaches do not align. Trade relations are another area for possible tensions between the two. In Europe, Trump's critical view of NATO and his approach to the war in Ukraine are likely to strain transatlantic alliances. This raising concerns about regional security and the future of collective defense. These developments form the backdrop against which the recent collapse of Germany's governing coalition has to be understood, as it struggled to reach a consensus on removing the debt ceiling. For example, raise finances for Germany's support in Ukraine. I very much look forward to hear our expert panelists analyzing these and other aspects for us today, and thank them very much for making available their time and insights. I'd also like to thank CSDR for their continued partnership with us. With that, I'll now hand it over to Devika from CSDR to take it from here. Over to you, Devika.
Thank you, Shalini. Again, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, for depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Devika. I work at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research, and I would like to welcome you all on behalf of CSDR. A brief introduction, CSDR is a New Delhi-based think tank where we combine global and regional expertise to deliver tailored interventions rooted in research and experiential knowledge. And our expertise covers foreign policy, geopolitical risk, defense, geoeconomics, climate change, peace building, and tech policy, to name some, with regional expertise in the Indian subcontinent, Eurasia, and the Indo-Pacific. We are delighted to be hosting this webinar with HBS, Trump 2.0 Implications for India and Europe. This is the fourth of our ongoing collaborative webinar series, Indian Foreign Policy, People, Power, and Perspectives. So without taking too much time, to kick things off, let me quickly introduce our expert speakers. We first have our moderator, Professor C. Rajmohan, who is a visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore and also an advisor at CSDR. Welcome, Professor Rajmohan. Next up, we have Professor Rajesh Rajgopalan, who is professor at the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament at the School of International Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University. Welcome, Professor Rajgopalan. We also have Dr. Garima Mohan, who is Senior Fellow at the Brussels office of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, where she leads the India and the India Trilateral Forum under the Indo-Pacific Program. Welcome, Dr. Garima. And then we have Dr. Manish Thorangbam, who is the director of the Kalinga Institute of Indo-Pacific Studies. He has also recently worked with CSDR on a series of reports for our US Studies program on the US elections and their foreign policy implications, as well as domestic dimensions. I will link them on our chat box here. Please feel free to take a look at it. It's a comprehensive take on the US elections that recently concluded. So very quickly, some housekeeping notes. I request our panelists to keep their opening remarks to 5 to 7 minutes, Post the opening session, we will have a moderated discussion, after which we will open the floor for questions from our attendees. Attendees, please use the Q&A box to raise your questions for the moderator's consideration. That's all from me. I will now hand over the proceedings to Professor Raja. Sir, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Really, let me join Devika and the HBS team to welcome you all. We have a wonderful panel here, which is to discuss this very, very important and interesting topic. So I'll just make a couple of points at the opening, and then we'll listen to the speakers after that and have a discussion after that. Basically, this, I think it's important to, before we get into what happens between US and Europe and between US and India, it's important to note it's a major inflection point within the US polity and economy. And I think if we don't understand that, merely looking at it from the minutiae of foreign policy, I think we can easily get misdirected. I consider, for example, Trump and his team are talking about dismantling the administrative state, which the sea has seen dramatic expansion. The first phase in the New Deal era, then in the Great Society era, and then in the post-70s, massive legislation to deal with environmental and other social concerns. So what we're talking about is a dramatic overhaul of the governmental structure itself. Second change is talking about is really on the question of deregulation. The Republicans are always for deregulation, and I think what Trump is talking about today is a much more sweeping deregulation of the business environment. Drill, baby, drill is only one part in relation to the energy structure, but they're talking about a massive deregulation of the US political economy. And third, the big boost to American techno-capitalism that Trump has talked about, which is expected to get a very, very big boost with this. And coupled with this is the plan to do major tax cuts, but raise tariffs in a big way on imports from outside. So these are just one set of issues on the domestic side. Externally, I mean, the impact on the rejection of globalism or globalization, which has been the reigning mantra in the US for the last 4 decades. There's a rejection of that. There is a rejection of the WTO and the need to rearrange the global trading system that would better suit American interests. Second, there is a questioning of the alliances that are seen as free riding on American taxpayers' contribution. There's the question of great power relations, where, of course, there are divisions within the incoming administration. For example, one lot, in fact, those of you who've seen the National Security Advisor nominee, Michael Waltz in The Economist, essentially saying it's important to cut a deal with Putin and move on to Asia to deal with the bigger challenge. So the question of priorities of inter-theater concerns, those are pretty much there. One bunch calling for a focus on Asia, the other wanting to fight on all fronts. But then there is the immigration question. They talk about the biggest deportation operation across the board. So these issues, I think, will affect India and Europe in different ways. For Europe, actually, being an ally, the whole question of how Europe defends itself, what would be the nature of the burden sharing between US and Europe? That's a big question, especially given the challenges that Europe faces after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Then you have the question of technological competition, trade. In fact, more than US, Europe was the original, shall we say, father and mother of both the what we today see as a globalized economic structure, and that Europe's commitment to regional integration and globalization is being fundamentally challenged by Trump's policy. So how would the two main centers of global capitalism, how do they relate to each other, is going to be a big issue as well. For India, of course, general sense, it's not a bad scene, especially except on the trade issue, the convergence on the China question, on the question of broader burden sharing, on the question of immigration. Actually, Trump is not opposed to legal immigration, So widely seen as India actually in a reasonably good place. But of course, it has to do a lot of things on trade to make sure that this relationship goes forward. But in the end, the world we've known for the last 3 decades is not going to be around for long under Trump's impact. Therefore, the question of US-Europe relations as well as India-Europe relations need to be debated. My own hope is that the shakedown will get India and Europe to think more integrated manner about the two theaters and to find ways of working together. I'll stop here. I'll invite our participants to join the conversation. Shall we start with you, Rajesh?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can go. I mean, not an issue. So, shall I begin?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Rajamohan, and thank you to HBS and CSDR for inviting me. I'll just make, since we will have a subsequent discussion, I won't spend too much time here now. I just want to make 4 points very quickly. The first is that, when we talk about the potential impact that Trump will have and the negative consequences of that, one of the things that we need to recognize, obviously, is that the situation is already bad. I mean, so we are starting from a bad position. We aren't starting from a good place. So that makes things even more dangerous and even more problematic, considering that we aren't starting from a good place. So one of the reasons for why this is a bad situation is, of course, that the Biden administration has a pretty bad record on foreign policy. It's living a situation that is in a pretty bad situation for the Trump administration, whether it is in Ukraine or the Middle East, and slightly better on the Taiwan side, but even there it's not a great situation. So it's already a bad situation. Secondly, I think even more importantly is that the US does face some challenges, but the challenges that the US faces are not systemic challenges. And that is a particular problem because to get the US to do anything requires that the US be motivated, and requires specifically that within American domestic politics, there is sufficient interest in generating American resources for dealing with problems. In the current situation, one of the problems we have is that even though China could potentially, over the longer term, be a systemic threat to the United States, as of now, both China and Russia and North Korea and Iran, these are all regional threats. And so for getting the United States involved, it becomes somewhat difficult because the US does not see a direct threat outside of maybe access or outside of control over regions of time. So what we're seeing is basically a series of regional challenges, which makes it difficult to get Americans motivated about seeing these as direct threats to the United States. I mean, if you recall the famous incident where Truman was going before the U.S. Congress, and I think Senator Vandenberg, I think, told him that the only way he can get containment passed through the U.S. Congress is by scaring the Americans, scaring the hell out of the American people. So right now, the key point that Dr. Rajman talked about, the domestic political aspect, the changes in domestic politics, Americans don't see a direct threat to the United States. And so, and to some extent, they're right, obviously, because these are all regional threats as of now. And so getting them motivated for this is going to be somewhat difficult. So in a sense, we are already in a bad situation. And essentially, we are going to have to deal with many of the regional problems. The regions will have to deal with the regional problems. And so that's the key problem in the sense that so the second point that I would have is that in that basically Asia and Europe are on their own to a significant degree, because the problems they face are not systemic problems that affect the entire international order. It doesn't affect the United States as much. It would on the long term, but immediately at least it's difficult to get. These are primarily regional problems, and so Europe is to some extent better placed than Asia is, because Europe, of course, has no dearth of resources. Europe has a power far more powerful than Russia is, which is a primary threat in Europe. But the performance so far of Europe has been pretty pathetic, and they refuse. It doesn't look like Europe is going to get its act together anytime soon. So that, in a sense, the failure of attention, failure of imagination in Europe is a primary problem. In Asia, it's a much more serious problem because China is stronger than all of the other Asian powers put together. So it's already well over 50% of Asian GDP. Its military power cannot be contained by Asian powers alone. In that regional sense, it is a lot more problematic. And this is also one reason why I would suggest that looking at bilaterals about whether it is US Europe relations or US India relations doesn't entirely get to the main problem, because what we are looking at is a problem at the regional level rather than at the bilateral level. As Dr. Rajamohan mentioned, India does expect things to get better in the US-India relations. But the problem is that ultimately, I think India is also being overly optimistic, because what we are looking at is a general condition. And Trump doesn't have any particular love for anybody or any country. I mean, so he's primarily motivated by his own personal desires and personal wishes, and not any particular affection for anybody else. So that means that the general consequences of all of these problems will affect India as much as it will Europe. And I don't think having slightly, I am assuming that Trump will not spend too much time on looking at liberalism and democracy and things of that kind. That might be seen as positive in New Delhi, but that is not the sum total of the problems that India faces. And so that for the larger set of problems, the regional problems that India faces and Europe faces, I don't think there is going to be very much by way of solution. The final point that I would make is about the administrative capacity. One part of the problem that the US faces is, of course, its interest, its willingness to do things beyond its borders. But the other part, even if the US wants to, I think, is administrative capacity that to some extent, Dr. Rajamohan also mentioned this, but if he's really going to go seriously against the existing bureaucracy, or what is called, quote unquote, the deep state and so on and so forth, he's not primarily, I mean, Elon Musk maybe, but he's not primarily interested in policy issues. Trump is not. Trump is primarily interested in making sure, first of all, that gets vengeance against people who acted against him, and secondly, making sure that there aren't any agencies in the administrative state that will act against him. And so that is his primary motivation. So if he's really going to go against the bureaucracy, fundamentally restructure the bureaucracy, make sure that the permanent bureaucracy is pushed out and his sympathizers are placed in their place, that is going to create enormous amount of chaos within the US administrative state, which would make it also much more difficult for the US to be able to get anything done internationally. So even if that kind of chaos might help him in his personal objectives, but it will make it much more difficult for the US to do anything. And of course, that potential danger, that chaos can create problems for far longer than 2028, when he will leave the scene. So I think that will last even longer than that. So let me stop here, and we can have a discussion later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rajesh. Maybe now I'll ask Monish. Monish, you want to come in? 5 to 7 minutes max, then we can.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll jump right into some of the things that Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan put across, and I think it's going to be a case of who are going to be in the direct firing line of Trump's America first, and who are going to get the stray bullets. I think a lot of countries are going to have to figure out, which are the stray bullets and which are the direct firing line. As things stand now, many of the European countries think that they're in the direct firing line because of his um, views on NATO. And as pointed out earlier, countries like India seem to be having a bit of a calm confidence that the bipartisan support and the personal leadership relationship that we have had in his first presidency could sort of sail the relationship forward. I think that's what we are going to figure out. Three key words are really floating around when we think of Trump 2.0 and how countries across the world are going to brace up for a turbulent period of 4 years in a world which is already turbulent, which Professor Rajagopalan rightly pointed out, that a lot of water have flowed down the rivers since the first time he came to the White House, and the 4 years of the Biden presidency. And I think we also have to remember that, you know, uh, it is a post-Afghanistan America, and that's going to raise a lot of questions about America's deployment in overseas conflicts, and also the mood inside America of how much retrenchment and how much involvement is palatable within America. And I think here I would like to point out that although the isolationist Trump and America first is often associated with him, the retrenchment policy and the kind of burden sharing that he's talking about, of course, he talks about in a much Buddhist sense, than compared to Obama or compared to Biden, who have a more diplomatic sense of telling the NATO partners that they need to pay up, instead of Trump, who goes around saying that, America's defense of Taiwan is nothing but an insurance policy that the Taiwanese have to pay up. But I feel that the retrenchment policy is something which is sort of carried down over the years, over the presidencies towards the Trump era. And I think the Trump presidency sort of like puts more premium into the insurance policy analogy that he keeps using. So I think the words transactional, the words quid pro quo, the words reciprocity, they're really sort of like uh, the I think the phrases through which we have to navigate what are the implications of this America First policy when it comes to how do we deal with this reciprocity? What are the implications of this reciprocity on security, on economics, right? What do we mean by quid pro quo, and what are the flows for the quids, and what would he expect from India? I think these are the questions that would, I think, really reframe the way in which we look at the pros and cons of a Trump presidency. And I think one of the things that Trump presidency has really brought in is this lazy sense of analysis for people like us who, you know, who come to the point of continuities and changes in foreign policy. I think the Trump presidency, the 2 years, I think the two terms, I think, are going to really disrupt the sense of how we look at continuities and changes in foreign policy, especially in U.S. foreign policy. Um, uh, you know, because there is a lot more than this just reframing analysis based on these two terms of continuities and change. The third point that I want to bring up is because we just had G20, we had APEC, we had COP29, we had BRICS in Kazan, and Trump has said that if he comes to power, he's going to pull out of IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is, I think, just starting to take nation steps as a response to China's RCEP, right? So, and he has already said that he's going to pull out from the climate pact, right? So, I think it raises a lot of question about the future of multilateralism, right? What shape multilateralism is going to take? uh, is the Trump 2.0 a new software reloading within the hardware of the multilateral framework that we already have? Um, on the part of security, I think there is a lot of, I think, rethinking that's going to take place in Asia as well, in terms of the future of mutual defense treaties that a lot of Asian countries have with the United States, depending on what's going to be the future of the much flaunted integrated deterrence that was sort of buzzword as Low and Astad went around traveling Asian countries and reassuring Asian countries that America was behind their backs and integrated deterrence was the way to go forward. I think the 4 years of Trump presidency is going to raise a lot of questions about the shape that integrated deterrence or even extended deterrence is going to take place if he doesn't totally dismantle it, right? So it raises a lot of question about regional defense spending. There's a lot of murmurs within South Korea and Japan already. One of the things that I would like to also point out, and I finish it with these 2 points, is that as soon as Trump came and the team came, like the NSC, NSA, and the State Department and all, one of the buzzword in Indian television news has been that these guys are hawkish on China. They're going to be good for India. I think that will require a lot of rethinking in terms of the causality and the correlation between Trump team getting hawkish on China for the sake of America, and what does it really mean for India-US relations as we go forward in the Indo-Pacific. And I would like to second Professor Rajesh Rajagopal by saying that Trump is ideologically unhinged, right? He is not with this autocracies versus democracies. That is done away with. And I think this raises a lot of question about how Trump sees any country as an asset to America. I don't think he has the mindset to see any country as an asset to America in the long term, except if it doesn't show off a good deal for brand Trump, right? So I think that's going to have to go through a lot of rethinking. And last but not the least, we are going to see a lot of economic framing of security threat. That's already happening when it thinks of China, when it thinks of Europe, when it thinks of Asian security. There is more of an economic framing of how you see security threats. And I think at last but not the least, referring to the tech ecosystem. This is where I think India and EU have to work together a lot. That if we are going to see a divided tech ecosystem, how does India and EU come forward in terms of working towards building a tech ecosystem on trusted technologies? So I'll leave it there. I'll come back during this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Monish. And Garima, you want to come in now in 5 to 7 minutes?
Yeah, sure. I will focus mostly on Europe-US relations because the previous two speakers have covered the sort of broader regional implications. So Trump's win in Europe obviously was seen with much disappointment, but at the same time, we have not seen Europeans preparing for this contingency. It was pretty clear till a few weeks ago, before the Harris campaign gained traction, that this could be a real possibility. But we did not see any conversations around increasing defense spending, for example, looking at NATO and what to do in case of a US withdrawal. Also, the sort of war in Ukraine has become global in the sense that we have the EU has just published evidence of China's involvement, particularly through weapons and drones, and the talk of North Korean soldiers now fighting in the conflict. I think a lot of these trends and issues were visible in Europe, but we did not see any attempts at rethinking the security order in Europe and its dependencies on the US and what to do as a result. I guess it is also primarily because of the economic downturn that we've seen in many countries. The German coalition, we heard within 24 hours of Trump's election that it was more or less falling apart and effectively dead. So I think with all of these trends, there has been a sort of inward-looking trend and not a lot of thought into what to do on the questions of Ukraine, NATO, security, defense in case of a Trump presidency. I would, though, like to talk about China here too, because what most people don't really know on the outside is that under the first Trump administration, there was a lot of cooperation between the US and Europe on issues related to China. We saw Trump officials going through European capitals to talk about the question of 5G security, Huawei particularly. But the US-EU dialogue on China was created in the very end of the Trump administration. Even the sort of question of connectivity partnerships, global gateway. So in that sense, when Trump won, we saw this sort of push of working with partners and allies on the question of China. But there are still doubts in Europe what will happen under the second Trump administration, because we've been getting contradictory signals. One is the sort of Lighthizer scenario of calling for full trade and tech decoupling, which will create problems for both Europe and India. The second is the trade deal scenario. A lot of people in Europe seem to believe that the talk of 40-60% tariffs on China is to get them to agree to a phase 2 trade deal and make some concessions to the US. What happens to partners like India and allies in Europe in that scenario? And I think those are some of the questions and conversations that are now happening in Europe, which could be a chance for Europe and India to do more together, to sort of look at each other and look at contingency options of how to deal with the US that is more isolationist. And I think here it is a good signal that we got from the incoming EU Commission. Apologies if you can hear a signal on the traffic light on the outside, because I'm in Brussels and there's always some VIP movement happening here. But a good signal we got from Brussels and the incoming EU Commission President von der Leyen is that she wants to really focus on the India relationship, make something out of the Trade and Technology Council. Now that we know that it's going to dissolve most likely with the US, I think these open new areas of conversation between Europe and India, particularly on green technology, for example, clean energies, where Biden and India, the Biden administration worked closely with India, and there were lots of sort of private sector partnerships, but also government to government initiatives, which most likely will be dismantled under Trump. And so there are perhaps new scenarios of Europe and India working together, in a sense, middle powers sort of trying to come up with solutions in case of, a US that is happy with the trade deal and then more inward looking. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Garima. That was, we had all the three speakers. We wanted some interaction between the moderator and the panelists for the next few minutes. I also see we have a lot of European friends in the audience. We'd like to see a lot of them participate. I don't know, Devika, how are you organizing this? Do they speak directly, or they're going to pose questions? So if you can give them instructions on the chat, that'll be useful. So let me start with Rajesh. I mean, I think you said something interesting. In a way, the US is not directly threatened. So in a way, it can play this with softer hands. Especially, it drops the argument of the traditional liberal internationalist that the US must be the leader, US must exercise leadership, and that it must actually manage every regional situation. If Trump discards that notion, and actually he has a lot more room to play in terms of how he deals with each of the regional players. So that is, maybe you can expand on this, because US can easily, even minor changes in the US policy can have big impact on the regions. For example, we saw if the US decides, as some people say, look, it focus on Asia rather than on Europe, I mean, a set of outcomes follow. Or that if it modifies its arms transfer policies, I mean, it can make a huge difference to all these regions. So that's one point I wanted to talk about. The other point, much of the talk about, the American decline actually ignores the fact that the US position relative to Europe and China has actually grown. Europe as a Eurozone, as a percentage of the US, has declined in the last 20 or 24 years. And China has slowed down. So in some ways, American dominance or the great power constellation is only going to increase. So taking this and the earlier point you made, how do you see this playing out without demonizing Trump or what he does, or actually that he can actually fairly easily rearrange the regional dynamic?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Azman. So the first one, in terms of there not being a direct threat to the US, I think that's one of the key points that is being made by a number of advisors to Trump, and including Trump. I mean, Trump and Vance and others about Ukraine. Now, when it comes to China, Ukraine and Russia, that Russia is not really a direct threat. Russia is a weak power. I mean, it's a regional power. It's not really a significant threat to the United States. And so why are we sending money sending money, billions of dollars to Ukraine when we need that domestically here. So that's connected to that domestic problem, especially because it is the link between Russian behavior in Ukraine and American interest is not very clear to a large number of Americans. Now, when it comes to China, there are people within the Trump orbit who make the argument, including Marco Rubio, as well as several others, Walsh and others, who see a sort of a shift from one theater to the other, from Europe to Asia, as necessary because they do see China as a long-term threat, but that is not uniform across the Trump world. I mean, and Trump's own perspective on that is not very clear because Trump seems to want the Fortress America sort of an attitude, has kind of a social Fortress America kind of an attitude where he doesn't want to have very much to do with any part of the world. So the tariff part of it is also related to that because tariff is one trade is one link that US has to other parts of the world, and if you cut that off, it is like cutting off a bridge across a moat that connects the United States to the Eurasian continent. So in a sense, it is. I think there is even China, despite the fact that China is potentially the most powerful other challenger to the United States, is not really seen as a direct threat to the United States. And so, the constant question, even when it comes to Taiwan, is why isn't Taiwan doing more? Why isn't South Korea doing more? Why isn't Japan doing more? Right? I mean, so this has a long sort of a there's a long tradition of this on the American conservative side, and so that question is going to keep coming up. And so I don't think that just because China is seen as a threat to the global order, that important sections of the Trump world see that necessarily in that sense. And so that could be a potential. So for me, that seems to be a bigger problem. When it comes to American position within the global system, yes, U.S. position has improved. People don't recognize how much American growth rate is spectacular for a country of that size, or an economy of that size. But the problem is we look at it in terms of aggregate of US versus Europe versus China. But within the US, that distribution of that growth is of course not even. And so that is led to a major difference in terms of how Americans feel about the growth rate, because they don't seem to the primary reason for why Trump did well in the election was because of ordinary American sense of economic well-being, or rather lack of sense of economic well-being. And so it's a distributional aspect of economic growth. So for us, when we stand back and look at it in terms of comparing the US to the other great powers, yes, US has grown. But I mean, when Americans look at it, when ordinary Americans look at it, American voters look at it, they don't see that. And so it's very difficult to convince them that the US is doing well. So I think that matters also.
Thanks. Monish, I wanted to ask you, I mean, there is a problem given the liberal demonization of Trump and what we've seen in the last 10 years. The liberal opinion, the mainstream liberal media have not really been good indicators of what's actually happening in the US. They completely misread the 2016 election. They completely misread the 2020 election. So should we simply accept that argument, or see Trump as actually not an aberration, but actually a part of American tradition? For example, some people talk about Walter Russell Mead's classification of a Jacksonian tradition that is actually one which says, look, we're not going to be everywhere, but anybody messes with me, we're going to go after them, but we're not going to go fight every battle. So that idea of fighting every battle was really a liberal internationalist construction. By no means it is the only way of thinking about US interests, and we had the Jacksonian tradition, which which has always been there, which is kind of muffled, shall we say, after the Second World War. If that is coming back, we have to deal with it, right? I mean, there's no point saying this guy's unhinged or he's stupid, or that's a reality. And since American, even if he's stupid, we have to deal with it. Go ahead.
Thank you for the question. I think it's, yeah, it's perfectly right in saying that we have to deal with, uh, you know, whoever is in the White House. Trump, I don't see Trump as an aberration in that sense. Definitely, I think he is a phenomenon of the sorts that has never occurred in American contemporary history as far as who comes to the White House, right? And I think a lot about in my interaction with American peers. Also, I think a lot about what does it really say about the POTUS resume? What is the resume of the one who runs for the presidency, right? So I think Trump has disrupted our normal sense of who runs for an American presidency. One with a public office experience, one with foreign policy experience. When Nixon came in, I think he was the one with the highest amount of foreign policy experience. And we try and compare George Bush that he didn't have foreign policy experience. I think we throw all of that out of the window when we look at Trump and see, okay, what kind of an experience he brings into the White House and what kind of team he builds for taking forward whatever vision he comes with. And there is a lot of debate already between the differences between the first team and the one that he's building right now, the loyalists and all those things. And I think it's what Russell Mead was talking about in the sense of the Jacksonian. I believe that there is a large, that's why I said in the beginning that it sort of disrupts the way we look at changes and continuities in US foreign policy. There is definitely continuity despite dramatic change that we talk about when we speak of Trump. Because if we just look back and read one of these longest interviews that Obama gave to the Atlantic to Jeffrey Goldberg around the time he was ending his office, he keeps talking about, the point of American strategy is not to do stupid things. And by stupid things, he was really referring to foreign wars, costly wars. And just post 2008 financial crisis, we had Michael Mendelbaum from Brookings writing this small book called The Frugal Superpower, raising a lot of debate about, how do you become superpower by exercising frugality, which is at the very heart of Calvinist ideas within the American society as well, the beginning of the American state as well. We had Richard Haas writing something like nation building start at home. So I think there is a continuity, That's why I said that, the way Obama and Biden talks about retrenchment is different. The language are different, but are they speaking the same thing or are they speaking something dramatically different? I don't think they are dramatically different. When it comes to the foreign policy schools, I think, we can sort of like set aside the Wilsonians and the Jeffersonians to some extent, but I think we need to do a lot of mixing together, concoction of a new brand of Jeffersonians and a new brand of Hamiltonians, and how Trump idea of retrenchment, Trump's idea of looking at countries as assets, Trump idea of looking at alliances and partnerships and threats is very, very economic in nature. It has, an economic framework to it. So I believe that there is, Trump is entirely not an aberration. There is a lot of complex concoction of a lot of trends that we have seen in American foreign policy over the years. But he brings in a new brand of America first and isolationist, which is again drawn from history, right? There's a lot of American presidential historians who are already talking about how we need to look back at the interwar period isolationists to really understand the strands of where the ideological moorings of Trump's advisors and his team are coming from. So it's not entirely an aberration. I see a lot of continuity in there.
Yeah, I mean, the other point I wanted to, Rajesh made when we talked about the dismantling the administrative state, it's really, presidents come and go, but bureaucracies remain. I mean, as you know from our own Indian experience, and over the last 3 decades, Europe too is now a big bureaucracy. I mean, the idea that, that the fact is appointing Musk and Ramaswamy with a clear mandate to dismantle the structure, we have to take it seriously. But at the same time, when you would imagine, we can already see the liberal press going at him. There will be resistance, even though he has a majority for now in both the houses. The battle, as Rajesh said, would it exhaust him, prevent him from doing what he wants to do externally, or the system will bend to his demands that, look, Reagan did this, but what Trump is talking about is a much more sweeping dismantling of the regulatory structure. So how do you see that fight playing out? And what does it mean for Europe and India? So I thought broadly in the internal fight on deregulation and dismantling the bureaucracy, how that might play out.
I mean, it's quite interesting the structures that we are seeing emerge under Trump too. I think it's very clear that on departments and areas where he doesn't really care that much, for instance, state. He's appointed regular Republicans who are very popular, like Rubio and Mike Waltz. On the areas where he really cares, like the Department of Justice, as well as the intelligence agencies, and the sense of that he's been wronged by the system, he's put in people like Tulsi Gabbard and Gates. So it's interesting to see that Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, they were not part of the Treasury sort of secretary. They've set up an independent, different body for government efficiency. So it would be interesting to see whether this has legs. I mean, there's no question that he's trying to undermine the administrative system and the bureaucracy set in place. We saw that under Trump 1, where a lot of people, for example, resigned from state or left and sort of joined think tanks in DC and sort of waited for the government to change and went back. But I think we cannot sort of overstate this at this point. I mean, institutions have survived and continued during different administrations. It would be interesting to see what lasting changes this makes, or after 4 years, this efficiency, administration, if there's a fight for falling out between Musk and Trump, for example. I mean, it would be interesting to see how long-lasting these changes are.
Yeah.
If I may, I also wanted to comment on the question that you posed for Professor Rajagopalan on China, and I think I have a slightly different take on that China is not just a regional problem. There's a pretty strong bipartisan consensus between Democrats and Republicans that sees China as a threat to the United States. So it's not just an idea of China as a threat to global order, but more specifically to the US. And it was under the first Trump administration that we saw strong legislative measures being put in place to sort of keep China in check. And in fact, those policies were then further built on by the Biden administration, whether it is working with Europe, reviving the Quad, all of these trends we saw under Trump 1. So I think there is a pretty strong mainstream consensus that sees China as a threat to the US, and neither Republicans or Democrats would like to see the US sort of fall down from its position as the sort of strong leading actor in the world. Whether they believe in engaging in external wars or not, this has sort of been the cardinal sort of position throughout. So I think it would be, I don't really think that the US sees China just as a regional problem. And I do see that under Trump as well, this will continue. Mr. Trump might have different views from the Republican establishment. I mean, we've seen Musk went to China and has investments there too. So it would be interesting to see how this plays out. But just wanted to give a slightly different perspective on this question.
Since you're sitting in Brussels, I see that you have sunlight. I believe it must be one of those special days in Brussels when you have sunlight. So tell me, I mean, in terms of the Europe's divisions where everyone talks about, if you, as of now, what would you say the broad response to Trump has been in terms of across the board? I mean, both internally, we've seen a lot of divisions in Europe within the governments and between governments. So maybe just give us a sense of that to our audience.
I think the divisions in Europe have persisted. We saw that countries reaching out bilaterally to Trump after the election results were announced. I mean, France, Emmanuel Macron's tweet has had its own tone, and we saw this under Trump 1, 2, a sort of division between Western European countries, Central and Eastern Europe, that was interested in working more closely with Trump, given the security challenges that they face. And I think these divisions are quite apparent now as well. We do see that Brussels is now emerging as a strong actor under President von der Leyen. The Commission has been leading a lot of conversations on China, and I think right now they seem the best prepared to deal with the Trump administration. All the other capitals seem to have been taken by surprise. As I mentioned, Germany is sort of mired in internal politics right now, and we have till the election results and the new elections take place, we don't really have anybody in the driving seat. Macron going his own way. Even the UK with Labour now in power, a lot of people thought that that's perhaps an opportunity to revive formats like E3, E4. But right now, I think it's only been sort of each country trying to engage with Trump and perhaps at some point cut deals. And we haven't really seen a unified Europe. But I feel that in maybe in a few months, as the shock settles in, perhaps we'll see more conclusive trends emerge.
Before we wrap up this part of the afternoon, I'll request all our participants to just start putting in the questions. We got another 5 minutes. I'm going to ask them one more round, and then we go to the audience. So please start putting your questions in the chat box. Since we're talking about Europe and we've not said much about Russia and Ukraine, so I want to ask all three of you, how would this play out? I mean, we already have an escalation after 2.5 years of relative self-deterrence. The Biden administration is now open to escalation. Putin is playing his only one card that he has, which is the nuclear weapons. And then we have actually Trump talking about a deal. So how do you see all three of you, maybe I'll just go one after you, each of you, to think just how will this play out in terms of next few next few weeks, actually, as well as when Trump takes charge. Because we saw Trump and Biden meet. In a way, the escalation now might actually help Trump to make a case for a deal, while he's not the one who's escalated, because his own peace constituency does not want that. So I think it positions him better to bargain with Trump, at least. I mean, there's one theory that is going around. So maybe start with you, Garima, and then I'll just go the other way.
I think the plan with the Biden administration was always to sort of either have a package for Ukraine or sort of escalate before the new administration comes in. So I think he's sort of following through on that. I think getting a package for Ukraine approved right now wouldn't work internally for the US, but so this escalation was sort of coming. But I think all parties involved know. Putin knows, Ukraine, NATO knows, and Trump knows what he wants to do. I think it's pretty obvious that he will try to cut a deal. What that looks like, what the ceasefire arrangements look like, whether Europe accepts them or not, I think that is the bigger question. But for now, everybody is sort of waiting. I'm sure even the Russians are. They've sort of talked about the nuclear posture, but I'm sure everybody's sort of waiting till January when there will be possibilities of cutting deals on this. I think the most worried is Ukraine and Europe right now, because everybody knows of Trump's connections with Russia and what would that look like. Those questions are still there.
Yeah, Monish, what will a deal look like, and will it fly? Monish?
I think I'll go with some parts of what Garima had pointed out. That the most worried among the capitals involved in this whole thing is perhaps Ukraine, because the last meeting that Zelensky had with Trump in New York didn't really also go down well in terms of what I think what was seen and what was recorded. So I think Ukraine is worried, Russia not so much, but I would still be a little wary about putting too much thought into the causality that because there was sort of Trump's propensity to be soft towards Putin, and he speaks about this likeness and all those things which are flying around, that necessarily when he comes on office for a second term, it's going to sort of like play out in a way where a deal could be favorable to Russia, and it could end up being being on a disfavorable side to Ukraine. So I would still be wary about putting too much premium on Putin's closeness with Trump and how it plays out once he comes to office.
Rajesh?
Yeah, I get the sense that I don't think Putin has any great faith in Trump either. I mean, I'm sort of second what Dr. Torrenbaum said, in the sense that one of the what seems to be happening is basically they're pushing as hard as possible right now to get as much as possible before Trump comes in, because I think there is a sense that once Trump comes in, we don't really know whether how he will react and how he will act. The only other aspect to remember, though, is that there is almost nobody within the Trump, even Marco Rubio, who used to be a more robust supporter of Ukraine, is kind of wavered. So there is nobody within that spectrum who is willing to take on Russia or willing to support Ukraine. So in that sense, at least the reading even within amongst this circle seems to be that this is what Trump wants. I mean, how he will actually, what he'll actually do once after January 20th, we don't know. I mean, I would hate to speculate, but and I don't think what Biden is doing this late will make a huge amount of difference on the battlefield. I think Ukraine is in a difficult situation, and I think I think what Ukraine is doing right now is basically trying to sort of appeal to Trump in the hope that Trump will just to be contrarian, that Trump will be more favorably inclined. So I think that's the best thing that they can do in the current circumstances. So I think, but we'll have to wait and see how. I really don't have a sense of how he will react after January 20th.
Yeah. There is one question, a two-part question, maybe Garima can address this. Could Europe have done this better for the last 3 years? I mean, that's one part of the question. And if you look ahead, what is it that they can do? I mean, maybe you can tell us what are the broad options being debated in Europe. You have, European defense, strategic autonomy, or actually a new kind of Ostpolitik. You make compromises with Russia. So you could tell us broadly what are the lines in which Europeans are debating.
Yeah. So I think there are three broad areas that Europe will now think of. The question says, should they have reacted better? I think the first most important area is this idea of strategic autonomy and security and defense. I think this conversation should have started with the first Trump administration and continued under Biden. Unfortunately, that has not happened. I think second, there's an idea within Europe that perhaps they could make some concessions on the China front with the US. If the US wants to pursue a very sort of competitive approach with China, perhaps Europe makes some concessions there and gets something in return for Ukraine. That's the second line of argument. And thirdly, I think what should have been done, and I think now we see the signs of that happening, is that reaching out to Republicans to sort of, as Professor Rajagopal said, there's nobody in Trump's inner circle that is a strong supporter of Ukraine or really understands Europe. I mean, the transatlanticists have sort of disappeared from the administration. It's more the China specialists and the Indo-Pacific people who are there. So reaching out to Republicans, reaching out to potential nominees to talk about European concerns and maybe figure out a deal, since we are now in transactional times, to figure out a deal. I think these are the three lines that Europe should have pursued, and I've seen now signs of that taking place already.
There is a question, Garima, again, I think it's in the same question, there's a reference to Germany. I mean, after Scholz's phone call, I mean, Germany was seen as reluctant from the beginning, given their special relationship with Russia, their historic challenges. Where do you think Germany is going in relation to the US and Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, I think the within the political establishment, nobody will pursue ties with Russia. I mean, I think the Schroeder days are long gone. But within the popular sort of opinion, there is this question of given the sort of economic problems Germany is facing now, why has there been such a strong support for Ukraine? I think those are questions that any party would have to address as they now turn into election campaigns, like inflation, jobs. And I think those things are pretty evident, and I think that's across the board for Europe. I think that those questions would surface in any election. But I don't think anybody in Germany, in the mainstream political establishment, will think of pursuing some sort of a deal on the Russia front. Till after what happens after things settle down, that's a different question.
Yeah. Monish, there is a question on AFPAC. It's really, I mean, last time when he was in power, Trump really just wanted to get out of Afghanistan. In fact, the only regional policy they announced was on South Asia policy, which was really AFPAC policy. And Biden walked away. I mean, is AFPAC still on the map, or is it really Indians we're constantly worried about PAC and AF? But it's really Americans have done that and done and dusted with it. So you think it really matters to the new administration?
It did figure during the presidential debates, both with Biden and with Kamala, but it was not really the debates were not really in terms of like what is the future of US Afghanistan policy, but it was more of a blame game that, who went out and how badly the Biden administration went out, and the other side sort of coming back to the Austrian deal that the Trump administration cut with the Taliban. So I don't see too much of a debate or in a priority scale in terms of the Trump administration or anyone within the Trump administration giving too much, I think, bandwidth in terms of what they are going to do in that side of the South Asia, Central Asia region. But of course, I think the extended Middle East, I think, it's a matter of concern, and it's something that's going to be in their bandwidth. But what I'm really interested in how it goes forward is that when the Biden administration took over from the Trump administration South Asia policy, one of the things that I was constantly thinking about was what is a post-Afghanistan South Asia policy going to look like for America? That was constantly on my mind, and I would constantly sort of like come back and try to find evidences of connectivity projects in Sri Lanka and MCC in Nepal, or what else the Americans were doing in South Asia now that they were off from the AFPAC 20 years of bogging down. So I think what I'm really interested in as the administration takes over, and I don't know how this is going to play out. Are they going to really dismantle the connectivity and other kind of projects that the Biden administration took ahead, along with the Japanese? Bangladesh is in a bit of crisis, so the future of the Bay of Bengal, American involvement there, how do they look at China in Bay of Bengal? I think it's up for grabs now. I will be really interested in seeing what they make out of the $500 million investment that they have done in the Colombo port along with the Adani Group. I will be really interested in seeing how the incoming Trump administration are they going to really shut down their eyes, or are they going to continue the line that the Biden administration takes? Will they do something dramatically different in Myanmar? I look forward to that, because that will really define the contours of the neighborhood challenges for India, what the Trump administration would take forward in Myanmar.
Thanks. Rakesh, Rajesh, there is a question on how can India and Europe take advantage of Trump's transactional diplomatic style to secure deals that will be beneficial to them. So you think the style here opens some opportunities, or is it partly a problem as well?
Yeah, I mean, it always was transactional. I mean, whether irrespective of what government there was. I mean, sometimes we kind of forget that part of it, that it was not just Trump; it is always transactional. But I mean, Trump is much more openly transactional in the sense that, I mean, it is for him. It is, of course, this deal, and that is. I mean, it's only this deal that sort of a particular deal, whatever that deal is. So, I mean, we'll have to be much more narrow, I suppose, in terms of looking at specific deals. But also something that India is not very comfortable doing, which is look at linkage politics, with something which China is very comfortable doing. I mean, connecting, linking one issue to the other, saying, okay, I'll give you something here if you give me something here, somewhere else. I mean, I think that is something that
we
we
can
have
learn
always.
from China. Something we can learn from China.
Absolutely. I think that is in terms of if Trump wants higher tariffs or some deal with China on, let's say, on EVs or whatever, the Chinese will ask for something else somewhere else. I mean, so there's going to be a quid pro quo in that respect. I think that kind of linkage politics is something that India has traditionally been bad at, but that is something that we can potentially learn. Partly because, of course, our very siloized sort of foreign policy bureaucracy, which sort of, so we'll have to be able to bring together all the different elements of what we need, because it's whether it's commerce or whether it is other aspects of our policy. All of that has to be brought together, which is a lot more difficult in the Indian system because given the nature of the Indian system. So that I think that's a bit of a problem. But I think one of the other issues, what I was mentioning earlier about state capacity, as it were, because if Trump is really going to go after the bureaucracy, then that's also going to reduce American state capacity. And it has good bits and bad bits. I mean, the good bits is that it's possible that if he if he creates that much chaos, that there are things that will continue, like as Dr. Tauranga was saying, things that are already in the pipeline that they might not get to cut. I mean, so things might continue simply out of the fact that they don't even know that those things exist, and therefore. The U.S. bureaucracy is, of course, very, very large and very complicated, and so there are things that could be happening that could continue. But on the other hand, any kind of new initiative might potentially be problematic. So that also affects what kind of transactional politics that we can engage in if the U.S. doesn't have the capacity to do that. Well, so I see that. I mean, we really have to see how. The person he is putting in charge of the Pentagon is not somebody who has any experience whatsoever, which means that managing that bureaucracy is going to be a problem. So it's such a weird set of people that he's put in there that it's very difficult to figure out exactly how they will actually manage some of these issues. Especially the day-to-day running of the very complicated bureaucracies.
There is a question on immigration. I mean, saying that how will this play out? What happens to Indian students in India, students in the US? I thought, contrary to the widespread concerns in India, certainly Trump seemed to clearly distinguish between legal migration and illegal migration. Legal migration is something, certainly in the STEM area, which is where the American companies want it. I don't think they're going to give up that. So, in fact, in his interview to Bloomberg, Trump explicitly states, I'm going to support legal migration. He also says, look, good people must be brought here. Look at Musk. He was not born in the US. We got him here. So I think, so there is that difference. And meanwhile, the demand for Indian STEM talent is growing everywhere. Even Germans, despite the toxicity of the immigration issue, are taking more Indian technologists into Germany. So maybe, Garima, you can tell us a bit how this is the immigration issue, how the Europeans are seeing it, the similarities between across the Western world.
Yeah. So I think the concerns with Trump's policy is not so much that he's saying legal versus illegal immigration, I think with the people that he has in place, establishing what is legal, the hoops for that would increase. I think that is the concern that would also apply to, for example, Indian students. So we saw backlogs on H-1B visa application processing in Trump 1. If you sort of increase the threshold for what is considered legal and all the sort of hoops you have to jump through, I think that could be a potential bottleneck. But something that is common across the Western world is anti-immigration sentiment. We've seen the election of far-right politics, Netherlands, for example, in Europe, and there's definitely a push which is anti-immigration. At the same time, the governments are very keen on attracting skilled workers from India, highly skilled migrants, not just Germany, but across the board. We've seen India sign migration and mobility pacts with almost every single European country it has had a summit with in the last 3 years. So there's definitely that tension. But Europe did benefit, for example, after Brexit, the number of Indian students studying in European colleges increased and universities increased. So if they want to take advantage of this and particularly attract, people working in STEM areas, but also otherwise, this would be a good opportunity. However, domestic challenges in coming elections would hinder their ability to do so. Perhaps the only institution that can do that is the EU Commission, but we are not able to conclude an FTA with them.
I wanted, there's a question on Trump's approach to war and peace. Here, I think people don't give enough credit for Trump. I mean, since all of us trash him, it's very convenient because we all filtered through the liberal eyes. But if you look at this last term, I mean, he negotiated the Abraham Accords, which is kind of continued by Biden. He's also, tried to do peace with North Korea. He was the first US president to step onto North Korean soil. It had great support. His initiative had from that time President Moon of South Korea, who was also on the left and a bit of a peacenik when it came to North Korea. But it was really the nuclear and the hawkish lobby in the US which said, look, we can't just do peace without settling the nuclear question. So given his instincts to break out of the box, what are the possibilities for some big moves like that in the second term? I wanted to ask Monish. Monish?
Yeah. So that, I think, I'll come back to the question of, I'll link this to the question of the bureaucracy and American bureaucracy, the inertia in American bureaucracy, and the baggage that whether it's Republican administration or the Democratic administration carries forward in terms of the steps that they can take or they won't take when it comes to regional sort of debt loans. And I think to a large extent, the sled from which Trump starts gives him a little bit of, I think, edge in terms of at least having the bravado to go into deals that could, literally go here or there. So I think in the case of a more traditional sort of like, for the loss of a better word, deep step back candidacy from what the parties. I think there is a lot of thinking through it even before making those moves. So I think the disruptions that it brings into the American bureaucracy, and also the fact that it comes without a baggage, and this sort of utter lack of thinking through in terms of where certain moves can take it forward, whether it's with the North Koreans meeting Kim Jong-un. I think it puts him in that sense of sweet spot where he can make those moves. So I will not discount some breakthroughs, but the breakthroughs can also go in different directions depending on what is the scenario, because the scenarios are very different from the one that he left 4 years back.
Rajesh, you've written a lot on India-China-US relationship. There is a question here on the recent agreement between India and China to disengage. Would it kind of run counter to what Trump's hawkish policy towards China? And more broadly on the Quad, if sections of the Trump administration have said the Quad is becoming a talk shop, doing a lot of irrelevant things rather than a focus on the real issue of balancing China. So you think, given India's squeamishness on security issues in relation to Quad, I mean, how do you see this playing out? I mean, both the triangular dynamic, the question of the Quad, and where do you see India? Will it continue to dance on the line, or will it take advantage and say, look, if we do this, what do we get, kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that is an interesting question because, again, I think there are both ways of looking at it in the sense that on the one hand, India's reluctance to do anything on the security side together with other Quad members. I mean, India is the one who's been dragging its feet. So that could potentially irritate both Trump and people in the administration who might see this, because essentially Quad is only for India. I mean, it's the other three members of the Quad already have a variety of other security arrangements. I mean, so they don't really need the Quad to engage in security cooperation. So it is primarily to bring in India, and if India is reluctant to do that, then obviously, they might start questioning what's the purpose of this. On the other hand, the opposite side of that argument is that, unlike a lot of other countries, India does a lot on its own, which is something that, of course, they want their allies to do more on their own. So, but then the transactional part also comes in, which is that what are we getting in return? I think if they start asking the transactional question more seriously, that becomes a little bit of a problem for Delhi, because essentially it's not a transactional relationship in the sense that we aren't really giving a lot. India isn't really giving a lot back in that relationship. India is doing what it would do in any case, which is balancing China. And people talk about the fact that, we are the only country that has troops on the border facing up against China. That is because China willed it so. I mean, it wasn't because of India's choice. I mean, it was basically China that forced India into that action, and it's something that India would rather not do. So, that is not really, it's making a virtue out of a necessity. So it's not really helping a lot. I mean, so if the Americans start looking very closely at what various partners are giving in return to what they're getting, I think we might come off not looking very good. But on the other hand, like I said, there is a greater appreciation for India, the fact that India is doing things on its own rather than entirely depending on the United States. So I think there are both parts of the equation.
Yeah. Garima, there's a question on sustainability, which is, of course, a big thing for Europeans. Can the illusion of sustainability be sustained, given what Trump is openly saying, drill, baby, drill? He's really saying deregulate. He's got, for his interior department, a man who doesn't believe in climate change. So this is a whole new world, right? I mean, in a way, people are criticizing Europe for giving up the nuclear option, for actually going so far out that it's really going to find itself in difficulty. So where do you see the debate in Europe on sustainability, and how does it feed into the US relationship of Europe, and for us, India as well?
Yeah, I mean, the green agenda, sustainability agenda is very central to European policies across member states as well as for the EU. I think with the Trump administration, there are two concerns. One is the multilateral framework to deal with climate change, which is already troubled. And then if Trump pulls out, Europe, will they be able to step up? And the second concern is that with policies like CBAM that Europe has in place, which are more protectionist, that makes it difficult for them to even work with their own partners. India has, for example, registered opposition to it. So I think there will be this sort of choice in front of the Europeans if they want to do more on this agenda at the multilateral level, pull weight of Europe here. But then again, member states have different policies. So I think this will be, I mean, Europe will be one of the only sort of bigger Western powers talking about the agenda, but how much of an impact can they make remains like a big question.
Monish, there is a specific question for you, and I think saying is Indian euphoria. And I think, as you rightly said, is a bit exaggerated, unwarranted. That there's still so much of sentimentalism and emotion in way India deals with the US. One, it involves actually some kind of disenchantment with the Biden administration because of the what's happened on the Khalistan issue or on Bangladesh, rather than assessing how much the Biden administration has done to elevate India relationship. So is there a less, is a suspicion? The same people who are saying America is out to do regime change in India, today say Trump is the greatest guy in the world. I mean, where is the problem? Don't have? You're an Americanist. Is part of the problem that our political discourse in US is really ill-informed. There's not enough studies, so you can take a go at why we need more American studies.
Yeah. I think I'll start by saying that when we look at skepticism of America, this the streets seem to speak a different language, and then the policy circles seem to speak a different language. I think every time there's a regime change in neighborhood, and let's say America signing a deal with the Pakistanis, whether it's a refurbishment of an old F-16 plane or something, or if there is some turmoil in Sri Lanka or anywhere, Nepal, for instance, I think the way we talk of American, let's say, the contemporary post-independence history of India-US relations, I think there's a lot more to dig deeper into that, in the sense that, I think the first book that we pick up when we try to study India-US relations is the one by Dennis Katz, Estranged Democracy. And that word estranged, I think, gets implanted in our minds. That these are estranged democracies, but I think it just takes 2 or 3 days of digging deeper into archives to know that Cold War is much more complex. You have at least a dozen of evidences from within the Cold War where the American intelligence and the Indian intelligence cooperated to a large extent. You have almost a mutual defense agreement with the US and India playing out right after the 1962 war. I mean, you can go on and on. So I think there is a larger sense of great power skepticism in the involvement in the neighborhood, and that to a large extent speaks also about the power asymmetry, within India and the US, in the sense that at the end, US still remains a global power with interests which are global in nature. And if we look back into history and now, I think a lot of this skepticism and mutual mistrust sort of develops from the idea of what do we expect from each other. And I think even in the case of India and China, right, the border dispute in the Galwan standoff happened during Trump administration in 2017, and there was a lot of outcry within India itself that how much we are expecting from the US and what kind of things we are expecting from the US. Is the India-China border dispute even in the priority bandwidth of American policy making, or their China threat lies somewhere else? So I think the same questions are asked even within, especially the South Asia programs within the United States, that Washington expects a lot from New Delhi. Can New Delhi deliver? Right? We ask them, we expect a lot from you. Will you deliver? So I think we need to get out of the bilateral study of India-US relations and really get into the true sense of what American studies means in order to understand what are the priorities of America, what are the trends, so that we can navigate better. How do we fit into that scheme?
Two brief questions to Rajesh and Garima, and now we must wrap up. Rajesh, why is it that we're ready to believe the worst of the United States at any given point? I'm talking about the foreign policy community. Even when, as Monish said, look, there's a long record of positive cooperation. The first nuclear reactor was American. The first satellite was American. Entire, agrarian revolution was American. So, what is it in our political culture that a seemingly good relationship is constantly trashed, and the consistent pessimism in the discourse and the optimistic trajectory in which the relationship has gone. What explains this? Is a policy and discourse on two different tracks?
Yeah, I mean that's one of those questions that still remains outstanding. I mean, I think we all have our own sort of pet theories about why this is the case, because obviously the history is fairly well known. Because on both sides, I mean, whether it's during the Cold War, whether it's the United States support for India on a variety of issues, everything from China, as Dr. Dorenbaum mentioned, but also in the late 60s, mid to late 60s, on the famine, on food aid in the famine and things of that kind of, or a whole host of a space program got to start, the atomic energy program, atoms of peace and so on. So there's a whole host of areas, but I think part of it has to do maybe with a general antipathy towards the West, and since the US was the primary representative of the West, and I suppose at some level, the fact that India is a post-colonial society makes that understandable. But I think that's probably the only primary reason, because it's not even ideological in the sense that you have on both the left as well as the right opposition to the United States. And I think to some extent, I mean, there were periods when you had Swatantra Party and so on, which was slightly more tolerant, but by and large, what we have even today is both, and that opposition from the right comes from that cultural opposition, not so much the political opposition, but it's primarily a cultural opposition to the United States as representative of Western culture and about Indian culture being superior and so on and so forth. So I think there is all of that comes as primarily because of US being seen as a representative of Western culture. So but clearly that is still, that's kind of one theory, I suppose. I mean, there is there may be other theories about why this is the case, but it's remains a continuing mystery. But that also means that we have to be careful about what we expect.
Sorry, Rajesh, you have to finish up. Yeah.
Thanks. That's the point. Even the future will have to wait for.
Gariman, lastly, since we love multipolarity, whatever it means, and there was a time when the French used to talk about multipolarity. So is the Europe have a place in India's multipolarity, or Europe, can we work together? Because I see more of Asia in Europe, Iranian missiles, North Korean drones, South Korean weapons, North Korean troops. Is Europe ready for more Asia and more India in thinking about its security?
Yeah, I think definitely that the trend has shifted from 2018 onwards. Like before that, when we talk about the US-India relationship and how India perceives India perceives the US, I think Europe is even further behind, and with good reason, because till very recently, Europe's view of the world was primarily the transatlantic and then China in the Indo-Pacific, and that's about it. And I think as the Europe-China relations have suffered, and with the US Trump one particularly, Europe has sort of waken up. After Ukraine also, they've sort of come back to the world of realpolitik and understood that this sort of value-based post-modern entity that they thought Europe was, that's not the case. And I think since then we've seen definitely an outreach to India, and for India too. I mean, I've been working on this for a long time, and for the first time I've seen a rationale in Indian foreign policy of reaching out to Europe, particularly focusing on four things: technology and innovation, trade and investment, migration and mobility, and security and defense. So I think this is sort of harboring a change, and finally we see a rationale for India reaching out to Europe, and that is being reciprocated as well.
Thanks. And I think my internet connection is unstable, so I don't want to disappear again for a second. So I'll just conclude by saying that, look, we had a wonderful discussion. Three things are quite clear. One, I think the globalization order we're familiar with is going to change. And I think Europe and India will have to adapt and probably will find something common. The post-war security arrangements of the type the US has led, they will be under stress. that again should open some space for India and Europe to see how we can work together. And finally, on the question of technology, and I think we're going to see a big boom in the US in the technology sector. And Europe actually is really lagging behind. It doesn't have a single big tech company except SAP. So I think there again, hopefully what Garima just said, I think we need to work a lot more closely. So I'll stop here because this is a moment of great disruption, and this is a moment that India and Europe should take a fresh look at each other. So I hand over to Devika now. Devika, maybe just offer the vote of thanks, and then we can be done with it.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you to our panelists and our attendees for joining us today. I think it has been a vastly interesting conversation. Trump 2.0 continues to be an evolving narrative, and we managed to touch upon a very diverse range of issues as well as views. We have also come to the end of this current series between HPS and CSDR. India and Europe continues to be a relatively less discussed region in each other's domestic spaces, as we have noted time and again over the course of this series. Obviously, it is changing slowly with the momentum and ties we have seen over the last couple of years, which is why we are here, and which is what we are trying to do here. And we managed to look at so many important aspects of this relationship over the last couple of months. We hope to continue this important conversation and look forward to engaging with HPS again, and would like to thank HPS for this wonderful initiative. Thank you for our panelists once again, and thank you to attendees.